Today we're making the third and final video in my third-party BRAW trilogy by looking at the Nikon Z6 II, and I'll be doing a bit of a review of this camera while I'm at it, since I believe this device is now at its full potential, complete with the RAW upgrade and 4K 60 firmware. Let's get undone.
It's crazy, dun dun, Gerald dun dun. He's crazy.
What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. So, as usual, some disclosure. Nikon lent me this camera, this lens, the 24-70 f4, and also arranged for Blackmagic to send me this 5-inch video assist. This camera goes back to Nikon when I'm done, no money changed hands, and they do not get any input on this video's production or get to preview before it's posted. This video does have a sponsor though, and that's Storyblocks. Now, the focus of this video is going to be more on the BRAW update and evaluating the image quality using different formats, but since I haven't officially reviewed the Z6 II yet, I'm going to take a few minutes to do that first. Overall, I like this camera. I think it's pretty solid all the way around. As a photo camera, it's an improved version of the original Z6 and will offer a much better transition from DSLRs if you skip the first version due to the Mark II's improved speed and reliability, especially with autofocus. Handling and ergonomics are pretty much the same, which is a mix of good and bad. I think the button layout is intuitive. I like the dedicated photo video switch, the AF on button, and the easy access to the menu. I like the dials, the dedicated record button, and the joystick, although I do wish it was a little bit bigger. My biggest gripe with the controls is that I wish the back D-pad was a wheel instead to allow me to map it to ISO instead of needing to press a separate button. But exposure can be controlled using the touchscreen as well, and overall the touch functionality on this display is great, and I like this panel. It's clear and bright, but it is somewhat limited in its range of motion. It's just a basic tilt. I had no problems with the viewfinder, and I'm really happy that they added a second card slot in the form of a UHS-2 SD, which allows for backup shooting in photo mode, but not in video mode as far as I can tell. I'm still not a big fan of the menu system. This is completely subjective, of course, but I'd say Nikon's menus might be my least favorite of the major manufacturers. And it still features a lot of the same weird quirks as the previous version, like how you can't have zebras on while manual focusing, so you can't have zebras and peaking on at the same time. And there's still a delay on the back LCD, and an even worse one if you monitor over HDMI. Now, we'll obviously get heavy into the HDMI output later on, but something else that's kind of annoying is you can't output your on-screen information over HDMI in video mode. You can only output a clean feed. This, of course, makes it more challenging to capture some of the quirks and details I want to show you in this review, unless I film the back of the screen, and more practically, it makes using a larger monitor with an overlay impossible if you like to do that. It's using the same battery, but they have a new revision, the EL15C, which offers slightly better performance. I was getting around 1 hour 40 to 1 hour and 50 minutes of record time on average, which is pretty solid. Not the best, but nothing to complain too heavily about. But a noticeable improvement over its predecessor when it comes to powering is the addition of USB-C power delivery. Now when using an appropriate power bank or charger, you can get upwards of 12 hours of runtime. I was only losing a few percent of battery every 30 minutes with USB power delivery connected. And this is made more useful by the fact that I only ever experienced overheating in one mode, the 4K 60, but every other mode I tried, overheating was not an issue. However, if you are planning to record for long durations, keep in mind that this camera still has a 30-minute record limit, so you'll need an external recorder if you want uninterrupted recordings over that half hour, which is pretty lame. And when it comes to autofocus, like I said, it's much improved over the Mark I. The touch focusing is very smooth and natural looking, and you can make fine adjustments to the speed and responsiveness in the menu to dial in the focus pull you'd like. The tracking is pretty good too. It's not as sticky or reliable as Sony, but for less complicated shots, it can get the job done, and the interface is very easy to use. They've also added IAF for video, which works quite well, and I like how you can quickly and easily switch eyes by just pressing left or right on the D-pad. The only real issue I have with the autofocus on the Z6 II is that it's not as flexible when it comes to exposure. Dimly lit scenes don't work at all, and you definitely need to provide quite a bit of light on your subject to even get the system to activate. This is a noticeable deficiency when compared to what Canon and Sony are offering. But overall, I'd call the autofocus on the Nikon Z6 II pretty good. I'd feel comfortable using it in a variety of situations, which is good because the manual focus is horrendous. Not only are the lenses non-linear with no way to change that in the menu, but when you add in the loss of zebras, the design of the focus rings, and the inability to repeat a focus pull, this easily becomes my least favorite system for manual focusing when using Z lenses. IBIS is about the same as far as I can remember, meaning it's nothing amazing, but pretty good. I wouldn't choose this camera for vlogging, but it can definitely help to give you some steadier handheld shots. But after just using the Panasonic S1H for the last couple weeks, this is a noticeable step down. Rolling shutter performance is about middle of the road as well. It's better than most of the previous gen hybrids, but there is still some noticeable jello. Again, probably not the ideal choice for vlogging, but I think in many other scenarios that don't involve fast pans, you won't be too offended by it. And the performance is about the same when recording BRAW or even in 4K 60, which I thought was interesting because usually the crop mode improves rolling shutter, and 4K 60 automatically puts you into an APS-C crop on this camera, but the rolling shutter felt about the same regardless of the mode. Overall, I wasn't really impressed with the 4K 60 on this camera. First off, you can only record it internally at 8-bit, you can't shoot it in N-Log or BRAW, and it has noticeably lower detail and worse dynamic range. I suppose it's nice to have for the occasional shot, but it feels like we're really pushing the limits of this camera by using it. You can shoot 1080p 60 in BRAW though, and you can shoot 1080p 120 internally without any of those issues, but there's a lot of other little quirks when it comes to video modes and crops. For example, the only way to get proper full frame is to record internally, but all internal recordings are limited to 8-bit and don't allow for log profiles. The best you're going to get is their flat profile. However, I would like to admit that Nikon's flat profile is quite nice. It's very easy to work with and is one of the best straight-to-camera profiles I've used. But if you want more dynamic range, you have to use an external recorder. But if you do record 10-bit N-Log externally, you force a 1.1 times crop for some reason. I actually found it closer to 11%, but still, kind of weird. The one advantage of everything up to this point, though, is that with the exception of the 4K 60, we've been getting an oversampled readout from the 6K sensor, which is also why the 4K 60 1.5 times crop is less detailed. However, if you switch to BRAW, the camera takes on about a 7% crop, and then line skips what remains. This does create a softer image, and you increase the risk of moire aliasing and artifacts, but I'll also admit it's one of the better looking line skipped images I've seen. Depending on the scene, it might be difficult to tell the difference. Now you can also activate the 1.5 times crop mode for BRAW if you prefer to shoot pixel to pixel, which might help avoid some of the aliasing at the cost of a narrower field of view. But what's strange is you can't shoot 4K 60 in BRAW even when in that 1.5 times DX mode. So just those little quirks like that and the fact that it's using an HDMI mini Type-C connector make it a bit of a janky experience when it comes to recording externally. However, once you do actually get it set up and rolling, I was quite pleased with the image quality. And this is one camera that makes a compelling case for third-party BRAW recording. First off, you get a dynamic range boost. I was already getting a respectable 11.9 to 12 clean stops when shooting 10-bit, but when I switched to BRAW, I was able to push that up to around 12.4 if I exposed in a specific way and used the highlight recovery option, which is enabled in Resolve for this camera. And if you convert your clip to Vlog in the RAW panel instead, you can get 12.7 stops normally and up to 13 stops with highlight recovery. It's not that there's anything particularly wrong with N-Log, and since my original review of the Z6, Nikon has released an official LUT that does quite well to give you a finished looking image with accurate color, and that has a similar color intention to their flat profile, which is nice. But if you want maximum dynamic range, I recommend converting to Vlog instead, and in some shots, that extra detail you'll pull out of your scene by doing so will be quite compelling. Now when it comes to noise, there's a few things to consider. First off, if we just look through the ISO range for 10-bit N-Log, we can see that up to ISO 6400 is quite good, and up to 12800 is still usable, but 12.8 does start to get a bit rough and it falls off hard after that. I'd probably aim for an ISO 8000 max most of the time. There's a few color shifts here and there, but pretty consistent throughout the range as well. But keep in mind that those clips will have the camera's noise reduction applied and thus should be cleaner than BRAW, but to be honest, I didn't notice that much of a difference in noise between the 10-bit and the BRAW when exposed neutrally. It's a different story when you underexpose by a few stops though. Here I have a comparison of 3 clips, all shot about 4 stops underexposed and brought up in post. The BRAW clip was the only one that I was able to easily and mostly remove the color shift from. The 10-bit file accepted some correction, but kept this muddy purple tone in the shadows, and the 8-bit flat file was just a big green disaster. But when it comes to the noise, we can clearly see that the BRAW is noisier now, but the details are also present beneath that noise, where the 8-bit flat file has been obliterated by noise reduction. Now if we add our own noise reduction in post, both the 10-bit N-Log file and the BRAW file do well to keep quite a bit of detail compared to the 8-bit flat, leaving us with a trade-off to consider. The BRAW has a purer image when it comes to filtering and color, but suffers from line skipping issues, where the 10-bit oversampled image, while not as pure, is sharper with less aliasing artifacts. However, I think the BRAW wins overall if we factor in overexposure and pulling details back. In this shot, the sky was completely blown out, and so were the edges of the building. With the 10-bit file, pulling down the exposure gives us an image like this. We get some of the building back, but the sky is gone and there are serious color issues. With the BRAW clip, however, we saved the building completely with much better color, and the sky is a lot less nuclear with more branches retained. And this was just comparing N-Log 10-bit to N-Log BRAW. As I've already showed, you can do even more with a different gamma like Vlog, but you only have that ability if you shoot RAW. Oh, something I wanted to update you on too. Remember in my last video how I complained that the S1H BRAW files seemed to have a levels range mismatch, and they were coming up contrastier than the internal files? Well, the same thing was happening with the Nikon BRAW. So I was talking with Hook over at Blackmagic, and together we were able to narrow down the issue, and he sent me a test build of Resolve to try, and it solves both problems. So that means in an upcoming version of Resolve, both the S1H and the Nikon will no longer have that issue, and your images should match a lot better. So shout out to Hook for solving that so quickly. So now that that's fixed, how's the color? It's very, very close. I'd say you can comfortably mix the BRAW footage with your 10-bit N-Log footage without any issue, and both are giving a nice balance between pleasing and accurate color. When it comes to white balance, with the BRAW clips, you can change it in post and it works wonderfully. There's a control for temperature and tint, and there's also that exposure slider that we discussed in the S1H video that takes the place of the ISO adjustment, since you cannot change your ISO in post with this camera. The exposure slider works really well to increase or decrease that in a natural, logical way. But when it comes to setting white balance in camera, the Z6 II does have a custom white balance tool, but it's a little less intuitive to operate. You have to map it to a function button, but if you just press the button, all that you'll do is cycle through the presets. So you have to first press the button, wheel over to one of the custom slots, and then press and hold that same function button again until the target comes up. At first, I didn't think Nikon had a custom option. I thought it was just using the Canon system where you take a picture and then scan that picture later on. But I stand corrected, the custom white balance tool is there. It's just kind of hidden, which is funny because it's an excellent tool. It's accurate, it can be repositioned, and you can zoom in multiple times to set the target exactly how you want. Great job on this, Nikon. I just wish it was easier to find. Now, when it comes to audio, you've got a 3.5mm mic jack and a headphone port, and you have good control over the gain when set to manual, and an attenuator for receiving hotter signals, which is appreciated. There's also an option to set the range between wide and vocal, and although the vocals seem to capture less noise and rejected more unwanted sounds, I found it sounded stuffy and bland, and much preferred the more open sound of the wide response. Nikon has a reputation for having lousy preamps that don't do well when turned up to compensate for a weak mic signal. So instead, I decided to try using the Rode VideoMic NTG, which allowed me to turn that mic up and the camera preamp way down, and then I compared that to the sound of the Sony a7S III, which was also set to its minimum gain. And I found that the Sony was still a bit cleaner and fuller, but I didn't find the Nikon to be that bad, and it's definitely usable if you give it a decent signal. But don't take my word for it. Have a listen yourself while I tell you about today's sponsor, Storyblocks. Check, check, check. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you could really use some footage, but shooting yourself was either budgetarily or logistically unfeasible? Well, Storyblocks has you covered with an impressive collection of stock footage covering a wide range of subjects with unlimited downloads and 4K video. They're also amply supplied with backgrounds, overlays, and After Effects templates, and the interface is easy to use and navigate, and the clips are royalty-free for both personal and commercial use, so you can use them as much as you want, wherever you want. So if you think you could take advantage of a fantastic library of quality stock footage and effects, check out Storyblocks using the link in the description below. Alright, so let's wrap up. When Jordan and I discussed the S1H's new firmware, we concluded that the S1H is probably the worst camera to make a compelling case for BRAW on because of how well it handles internal recording. I would say the opposite about the Nikon Z6 II. It might be the perfect example of a camera being elevated by BRAW. You bypass the recording limit, you get white balance and exposure adjustments, you can improve your dynamic range by changing gammas or enabling highlight recovery, and you bypass the aggressive in-camera noise reduction, and you maintain integrity and color quality better in over and underexposure scenarios. The only thing you lose is the 4K 60, but like I said, that mode feels kind of half-baked anyway. And since you pretty much need an external recorder to fully utilize this camera's video capabilities, you might as well shoot RAW if you've gone through the trouble of rigging up the recorder. So I guess the real question becomes, is the Nikon Z6 II with BRAW a combo I would recommend? I'd say that if you're a Nikon shooter already and you're invested in Nikon glass, then yes. It's a great camera that'll feel like a natural progression. It really is solid in pretty much every category. No real standouts, but a good all-around hybrid system. However, if you're starting from scratch, I'm not sure it offers as compelling of a value in this very competitive landscape. The camera body alone is $2,000 US, and if you want to shoot RAW, you need to send your camera into Nikon for some bizarre reason, and they'll charge you another $200 to upgrade it for RAW recording. Then you need to factor in the recorder and media, and now you're easily hovering around $3,000. And conversely, if you consider the firmware updates for the Panasonic S5 that make it surprisingly close to the S1H, but for only $1,700 now, the Nikon becomes a tougher sell, sandwiched somewhere between those Panasonics and the a7S III. But to Nikon's credit, there really isn't a camera at its price point that offers quite the combination of features that it does. It trades off some of the more specific video functions like shutter angle and DCI modes that you'd find on those Panasonics for more reliable autofocus and faster photography, while using a higher resolution sensor compared to the one on the a7S III. So for now, it might actually be the most balanced option available on the market, a viable jack of all trades. But I'm a little worried for Nikon, because given its price and the fact that it isn't actually bringing anything revolutionary or industry-leading to the table, I don't think it'll take much for the competition to render it obsolete. Now, as a reward for staying till the end, I've been playing around with the idea of a segment called Second Opinion, where I throw the video to another creator I respect to give their thoughts on the product. I've done this unofficially in some of my other reviews over the last few months, and now we're going to do it again, but more formally. Today's guest used to shoot with Nikon a lot back in the DSLR days, but is completely new to their mirrorless lineup, but he recently got his hands on the Z6 II as well, and I've been wanting to hear his first impressions of the camera.
It is true. I had two Nikon cameras years and years and years ago, and I really enjoyed those cameras. The image quality coming out of this camera, even though internally it records in 8-bit 420, is good, especially with this 50mm f1.8 lens. It is pretty nice. The colors are really nice, and if you don't mind the 8-bit 420 footage, then I think it's pretty impressive, especially in the low light. This camera it surprised me. When it comes to the looks, this camera looks like it means business, and I like that a lot. It's a nice looking camera, and the ergonomics are really nice too. It sits in your hand, and there's this little bump here that sits right here. It's very comfortable, and this screen on top is just fantastic. You see your settings at a glance. And when it comes to autofocus, this is where we're slowly entering the indifferent area. The autofocus, I find it is fine, but of course, coming from the Sony cameras, I find it a little slow, and every once in a while it was losing the object. The tilting screen, not the flip out screen, I'm indifferent about this, because as much as I like flip out screen while I'm vlogging, when my camera is on a slider or on a gimbal, the flip out screen is very difficult to work with. So sometimes in my case, I prefer the flip out screen, so I'm indifferent about this. The 29-minute recording limit, 29 minutes and 59 seconds. I think that is why we shouldn't have that. Which brings us to something else I don't like, and that is when you hit record, there's no sound. When you stop record, there's no sound. There's no notification that says beep beep beep, we're recording, or we stopped recording, or like ding 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 ding. You know, it's been 29 minutes and 59 seconds, so we're stopping recording. This may become a problem if you're a one-man band and your camera is sitting over there by itself. You have to set up a timer to remind you that you're coming close to the 29 minute 59 seconds recording limit. I wish this camera was able to record more than 8-bit 420 internally. And I wish we didn't have to pay extra to be able to record 12-bit Blackmagic RAW and ProRes RAW. And when you switch to 4K 50 frames per second or 60 frames per second, you get a crop, an APS-C crop. You cannot record in full frame. That's something, it's not a deal breaker, but I didn't like that. I wish it had a feature that would stand out compared to the competition. I wish this had something that the others didn't. But other than that, I think it's a great camera. I think it's a camera that you can easily miss, but you shouldn't. Thank you, Gerald, for letting me be in your video.
But that's going to be it for me. I hope you found this video entertaining, or at least helpful. And if you did, make sure to leave the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, try setting the playback speed to 75%.
All right, I'm done.
Done, done, Gerald, done, done.